Cult That Kills Chapter 6. Aum Shinrikyo. If you inhale the mysterious vapor, you will fall with bloody vomit from your mouth. Sarin, 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 the chemical weapon. From Song of Sarin the Magician, printed in a 1994 Aum Shinrikyo pamphlet. Umbrellas. Newspapers. Not an unusual sight on a packed subway train during rush hour. Who knows how many people riding the trains in New York, Paris, Hong Kong, or Moscow at this very moment are carrying the very same items. But these familiar sights had a far more sinister purpose on the morning of March 20, 1995, in Japan. During the Monday morning rush hour, 5 men boarded trains at different locations on the vast Tokyo underground. They carried packages of sarin, a deadly synthetic nerve agent first developed by Nazi scientists that has the potential to be hundreds of times deadlier than cyanide. With the trains heading toward Kasumigaseki, the centralized government district, the men placed the bags on the floor of the subway car and punctured them with the tips of their umbrellas. They hopped off the train at the next stop, calmly making their way to an escape car. A syringe was in their pockets with an antidote to reverse the deadly nerve agent, just in case they had poisoned themselves. The attackers left little more in their wake than the sarin packages, which were wrapped in communist and religious newspapers to throw off the police. Over the next few minutes, the sarin gas dissipated through the air and spread through the cars. It was a silent scene of devastation that morning. Sarin constricts the airway, so the victims couldn't even scream out in pain as they gasped for breath and thrashed around on the ground, blood streaming out of their noses and mouths. At first, the trains kept running, spreading the chemical weapon throughout the system. 2 subway workers, including a deputy station master, died after removing one of the sarin packages from a train. Above ground, emergency responders treated thousands of stunned victims who had no idea what had happened to them and how they had gotten so sick so quickly. The attacks would eventually kill 13 people and injure and traumatize thousands more. Sarin also prevents oxygen from reaching the brain, and some people who survived ended up in vegetative comas or confined to wheelchairs. One woman had to have both of her eyes surgically removed after her contact lenses permanently fused to her eyeballs. Survivor Atsushi Sakahara, who was riding one of the subway cars that the sarin was released in, would later tell the Associated Press that he first noticed that his eyes were going in and out of focus. Seeing the newspaper-wrapped package on the floor, he instinctively sensed something was amiss, and moved to the next car. Looking back, he saw a man had lost consciousness. Sakahara, then in his late 20s, fled the subway and took a taxi to work, where his vision gradually got darker and darker, as if he didn't need sunglasses to look directly at the sun. The attack devastated the massive Tokyo metropolitan area, home to 32 million, and sent shockwaves of fear through the famously safe country. Japan was still reeling from the devastating 7.2 magnitude earthquake in Kobe 2 months earlier, which killed nearly 5,000 people and leveled buildings and highways. Slow disaster relief left victims without food, water, and shelter for days. Who was responsible for unleashing this chemical weapon, which had only been used before in a large-scale attack by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein against the Kurds? Turns out, it wasn't a terrorist organization from a far-flung corner of the world that was responsible for turning Tokyo into a scene out of a horror film, but highly educated scientists and doctors from within the country. They had orders from their half-blind guru, Shoko Asahara, that they took very seriously, launched their country, and the world, into an apocalypse. The cult, called Aum Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth, started as a yoga school out of Asahara's Tokyo apartment in the mid-1980s. In the decade that followed, Asahara gathered thousands of followers for his movement, which combined elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and New Age religions. And while many cult leaders predict the end of the world, Asahara perhaps went the furthest to set the end times in motion, building a compound at the foot of Mount Fuji, the country's highest peak some 60 miles southwest of Tokyo, where his brightest recruits could manufacture their own biological and chemical weapons. Shoko Asahara wasn't waiting around for the apocalypse, he was making it happen. And, he promised, only his followers would make it out alive. Becoming Shoko Asahara. Chizuo Matsumoto, who would later assume the name Shoko Asahara, was born in a remote and rural area of southern Japan in 1955. He was the sixth of 7 children, and his poor family made what little money they had weaving tatami mats, a traditional Japanese floor covering made from rice straw. Congenital glaucoma left Asahara with only partial vision from a young age. His family sent him to live at a school for the blind, along with 2 other siblings. Asahara stayed there until he was 20 years old. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who interviewed many former members of Aum Shinrikyo for his book Destroying the World in Order to Save It, Aum Shinrikyo, Apocalyptic Violence, and the New Global Terrorism, wrote that, "No adult is a mere product of childhood. There is always a forward momentum to the self that does not follow simple cause and effect." Asahara, who would mumble incoherently during his lengthy trial following the Tokyo attack, has been described as bright and charismatic, but also had delusional and paranoid tendencies that would change the course of his life in later years. He achieved good grades, had a passion for drama, and excelled at judo, the Japanese martial art that has the end goal of taking down your opponent. Asahara was also manipulative and cunning. He would use his partial sight to his advantage, offering to run errands for his fully blind classmates for the right price. He had aspirations of becoming the Japanese prime minister and tried to jumpstart his political career by running for class head at school. He was never elected, despite multiple campaigns and his efforts to bribe his colleagues with sweets in exchange for their votes. And although Asahara has been remembered as a manipulative bully, his teachers also recalled his ability to be kind, especially to his younger brother. According to intelligence expert John Perricchini, aggression was a way for Asahara to be assertive and counter his sense of inferiority. After finishing school, Asahara moved to Tokyo, where he said he planned to study for college entrance exams. He hoped to be accepted to a law or medical school but was never admitted. Whether he actually took the tests, however, is unknown. Instead, Asahara studied Chinese medicine and opened a clinic with the financial help of his new wife's family. But in 1982, Asahara was caught and convicted of selling fake herbs. The fines bankrupted him, and this professional failure led to his increased interest and study of religion and mysticism. New religious movements were cropping up across Japan in the 1980s, a phenomenon attributed to a decline in spirituality leading up to World War II, the economic downturn, and a more general dip in moral values. When Asahara was 26, he joined a new religious movement called Agonshu, which was led by the guru Siyu Kiriyama. This was Asahara's introduction to Buddhist teachings, and he spent the next few years gleaning lessons that he would later use in his own movement. But unlike Kiriyama, who died in 2016 and devoted his life to advancing peace and education around the world, Asahara ultimately wouldn't use the Buddhist teachings for good. This seems like a good place to pause and explain a bit more about traditional Buddhism, which is quite different from Asahara's interpretations. Buddhism is an Eastern religion that started around 2,600 years ago by Siddhartha Gautama, a former prince who renounced the world and would eventually become the Buddha after reaching enlightenment. Throughout the centuries, different Buddhist schools developed, including Theravada and Mahayana. Many, though not all, Buddhist schools place an emphasis on meditation as a path to enlightenment. Buddhists don't pray to a personal God, but instead work toward ending suffering by following the Buddha's teachings. At the core of the Buddha's teachings are the Four Noble Truths, which pinpoint the cause of suffering and offer a prescription to end it, reaching nirvana, by following the Eightfold Path, a code of conduct that includes right speech and right mindfulness. There were an estimated 488 million Buddhists worldwide in 2010, according to the Pew Research Center, which expects the religion to grow to 511 million by 2030. Though Japan is one of 10 countries around the world with the highest percentage of Buddhists, the religion has been on the decline since the end of World War II. And though there are always exceptions, Buddhism is generally considered a peaceful religion that stresses compassion and nonviolence. In 1984, Asahara founded Aum Shinsen no Kai. Aum is a sacred word and sound in Eastern religions that is often chanted, while Shinsen no Kai means something along the lines of a circle of divine hermits or wizards. In the early years, Aum was a yoga and meditation school that Asahara operated out of his apartment. Asahara was a skilled yoga practitioner, and his fledgling group had its first brush with fame the following year when a photo of Asahara appearing to levitate high off the ground with his legs in full lotus position was printed in a Japanese occult magazine called Twilight Zone. My anti-gravity experiments have kept me aloft for no more than 3 seconds so far. But the period is increasing steadily. Within a year, my body should be able to fly at will, Asahara told the magazine. Though it is generally agreed that the photo of Asahara hovering was staged, the promise of flight isn't that uncommon in some religious offshoots. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who founded Transcendental Meditation, claimed to be able to fly, and charged his followers thousands of dollars for access to his yogic flying courses. The Maharishi, dubbed the Giggling Guru and a source of inspiration for the Beatles and numerous other celebrities, died in 2008. Transcendental Meditation, or TM, claims to have taught mantra meditation to millions. Critics have dismissed this enterprise as a cult business. At the time of the Guru's death, the group had $300 million in assets in the U.S. alone. Asahara instructed his followers to increase energy and circulation in the body through meditation and breathing exercises, and advised them to rid themselves of worldly interests and desires. In later years, Japanese television would show Aum followers trying to lift off the ground by bouncing up and down on their backside. Asahara rounded out the mid-80s by wandering Japan as a homeless monk and studying Buddhism and Hinduism in the Himalayas. Along the way, Asahara believed that Shiva, one of the major deities of Hinduism who is associated with the destruction of evil, appeared and instructed him to lead a battle of good against evil. In 1986, after spending 4 or 5 days in meditation, Asahara claimed that he reached final enlightenment. Although he never explained what final enlightenment actually meant, it's generally agreed upon that enlightenment, which Buddhists often describe as waking up to the human condition, can take a lifetime, if not multiple lifetimes, to achieve. And it's generally not a thing you brag about having accomplished to others. In an interview with Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, Lifton explains it didn't really matter if Asahara achieved this heightened state of being or not, because he didn't belong to any reputable religious institution. He wasn't responsible to anybody or anything. But the act was convincing to his followers. And, in some way, it was convincing to himself. There's a strange psychology with some people that enables them to believe in their own version of events and simultaneously maintain a whole manipulative, con man side. The combination can be persuasive, Lifton said. Whether finally enlightened or not, Asahara spent his time in India meeting with established Buddhist teachers from recognized schools whose teachings have been passed down for millennia, including the 14th His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhist leader, as well as the influential teacher Kalu Rinpoche. He also met religious dignitaries in Sri Lanka, a predominantly Buddhist country. Asahara made a point of collecting as many photographs with as many of these influential people as possible for future Aum Shinrikyo marketing materials. Asahara would later claim that the Dalai Lama told him, "What I've done for Buddhism in Tibet, you will do for Buddhism in Japan." After the Tokyo attack, His Holiness acknowledged meeting with Asahara but denied giving him such a lofty mission. Despite his delusions of spiritual grandeur, those who met Asahara during the 1980s recalled him as smart, funny, and sane, while at the same time unsophisticated and unrestrained. It would be these charismatic attributes and ability to be what Lifton describes as an extraordinarily dignified and composed teacher, not his apocalyptic teachings, that would help his organization grow to include thousands of followers around the world. Aum Supreme Truth. Back from the Himalayas, Asahara renamed his group Aum Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth. Aum Shinrikyo's philosophy was based on a combination of Asahara's interpretation of Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity, as well as some of the disastrous prophecies that the French physician and seer Nostradamus predicted in the 16th century. As Asahara developed his guru persona, he started claiming that he was the first enlightened person since the Buddha. Every guru needs a look. Asahara's was a long beard, flowing hair, and colorful robes. And a guru needs his followers. Asahara found his through university appearances and his books. Asahara's new flock were the young and disenchanted, and Aum started recruiting new members from elite universities and upper-class families who were looking for purpose in life that they hadn't found in the workplace or through material possessions, and who likely lacked a religious upbringing. With Aum, they didn't have to question the purpose of life or make their own decisions. That's what Asahara was there for, to give them what one follower called a true blueprint toward raising their spiritual IQ. And, as Asahara became increasingly preoccupied with putting the apocalypse in motion, his cult specifically targeted university chemistry, physics, and engineering departments for the best and brightest minds they could coerce. Aum also used popular culture to reach new members, including science fiction magazines, Remember the Levitating Photo, Japanese comics called manga, and video games. In From Mysticism to Murder, Robert Lifton recounts some of the experiences that Aum followers told him. People had frequent visionary experiences, many of which had to do with seeing bright lights, that seemed to be their mystical logo. From very early on, the word among people who had undergone training with Asahara was that it was extraordinarily intense, extraordinarily rewarding. They describe experiencing high energy. And that energy itself took on a kind of mystical feeling because it really meant life power, immortality power. Asahara borrowed practices from Tibetan Buddhist traditions, including prostrations, or moving from a standing position to prone position on the ground, an act performed in succession by Buddhists to purify negative karma. Another significant influence was the concept of phawa, the idea that a person's consciousness is released through the top of their head after death, as well as devotion to a guru to progress to Buddhahood. Asahara's notion of karma, the law of cause and effect that affects different aspects of our lives, was also fundamentally flawed and quite different from the mainstream Buddhist and Hindu definitions that teach that one's karma can be changed through our actions and spiritual practice. For Asahara, everyone in the world who had not joined his movement had irreversibly permanent bad karma. Exterminating the world of these hopeless souls was a compassionate act in Asahara's mind, because their deaths would give them a pure and clean slate in their next life. This idea wasn't shared by all of Aum's members, but Asahara was the guru, so the teachings were thrust upon his followers as he became more paranoid and obsessed with the impending Armageddon, which he predicted happening in 1996 or between 1999 and 2003. Asahara also taught that Aum members had the unique ability to separate their body and consciousness, an important attribute that would come in handy during the end times, when they would be able to withstand a higher amount of heat than regular, unenlightened humans. Aum Shinrikyo displayed many of the classic signs of brainwashing. Cult members were deprived of enough food and sleep, forced to listen to tapes of Asahara singing on repeat, and given psychedelics such as LSD. Asahara also claimed that members could speed up their path to enlightenment. These shortcuts came at a price, $250 for the opportunity to drink Asahara's bath water, thousands more for a concoction laced with Asahara's blood, and a whopping $10,000 for access to an electrode helmet that claimed to pick up the guru's brainwaves. Many Aum members lived communally and wore different colors of clothing to correspond with their spiritual progress. Aum also promised medical cures for diseases and conditions, luring in patients who felt that conventional medicine had failed them. In one case, a woman with Parkinson's was treated at an Aum institute for 6 months using a combination of medicine, prescribed by cult physicians, and thermotherapy treatments in the form of scalding hot water. She was later told that she wouldn't be cured unless she gave 45 million yen, nearly $500,000, to the cult. Japanese journalist Shoko Egawa, who covered Aum Shinrikyo, would later tell Wired that the cult members lived in a purely imaginary world, one that combined primeval fear with a computer-controlled, cartoon version of reality. The first death attributed to Aum Shinrikyo happened in 1988 when a cultist died, supposedly suffering a heart attack after a long and intense meditation session. At the time, Aum was in the process of applying for legal recognition as a religion, which would open up opportunities for tax breaks and little government oversight. Fearing that the cultist's death might jeopardize this status, the cult secretly disposed of the body. The following year, a member planning to leave Aum who had also witnessed that first death was killed. Aum defectors would later report that any perceived disobedience was severely punished, if not by death, through solitary confinement or torture tactics such as electric shocks and being hung upside down. In 1989, Aum ended up receiving legal status as a religion, but not without a bit of wrangling. When it looked like things might not be going the cult's way, Aum members campaigned and protested until the authorities gave in. Aum Shinrikyo saw increased scrutiny in the 1980s after rumors swirled of missing members and abuse. Following these early deaths and unfavorable media attention, concerned relatives organized a victims' advocacy group and retained civil rights attorney Tsutsumi Sakamoto to investigate the cult and represent families hoping to rescue their children. In November 1989, Sakamoto disappeared suddenly, along with his wife and 14-month-old son. Although Aum was suspected to be involved, the cult wasn't officially investigated at the time, partially because authorities may have been concerned about the group's rights as a religion, the New York Times reported. Following the Tokyo subway attack, a former Aum member was arrested and charged with the Sakamoto family murders. Information from former cult members led to a massive search, which eventually turned up the remains of Sakamoto, his wife, and baby in 3 separate rural areas of Japan. Nearly 1,000 law enforcement officers had combed the main Japanese island, with Japanese television stations reporting their progress live throughout the day. Due to new information offered up by cultists, police believed that cult assassins had broken into the Sakamoto's apartment, injecting their victims with a drug before hitting them with a hammer and strangling them. The Supreme State. One more major event would occur before Aum Shinrikyo became even more insular and separate from Japanese society. In 1990, Asahara, who still had aspirations, even premonitions, of becoming a Japanese political leader, ran for parliament along with a few other cult members. Their performance at the polls was dismal. After growing up blind and failing to gain entrance to university, this was the last straw for Asahara. If he couldn't make it in mainstream Japanese society, he'd have to get to work and create his own separate state. Following Asahara's embarrassing defeat at the polls, Aum retreated into its own world, and Asahara's rhetoric ratcheted up as well. The guru started teaching that the world was on the brink of World War III. The United States would decimate the Buddhist world, leveling Japan using nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Only those associated with Aum Shinrikyo would have pure enough karma to survive, and Asahara taught that cult members should lovingly welcome the end of the world. Asahara had an axe to grind with Japan as well, and taught that Japan would suffer for persecuting him, just as the Jews suffered for persecuting Jesus Christ. According to Asahara, Aum was being targeted precisely because they were the only group capable of saving the world from chaos. As Asahara became more paranoid and delusional, he became fixated on weapons, in particular the fantasy of developing and building a giant laser. The cult got to work to prepare for World War III, and they had the funds to do it. Aum Shinrikyo's wealth had grown considerably over the last few years. They continued selling the meditation books and classes that were their initial bread and butter, but also diversified their business holdings, operating restaurants, electronic businesses, and having members sign over their estates. This initial cash flush paved the way for more lucrative business dealings, including land acquisitions that would allow Asahara to start building labs and buying equipment to start manufacturing weapons at Aum Shinrikyo's massive compound located at the foot of Mount Fuji. To avoid detection, these businesses were set up as separate corporations not directly linked to Aum. With Aum Shinrikyo activity centered around the Mount Fuji compound, Asahara set up a shadow government that mirrored the Japanese state. High-ranking Aum leaders were named ministers of various wings, such as health and welfare, construction, and intelligence. Aum's health and welfare minister, Seiichi Endo, was studying graduate-level biology at Kyoto University when he joined Aum. Just weeks after Asahara's political dreams were dashed in 1990, Endo was at work in a lab growing a botulism microbe collected from a northern Japanese island. With Aum, the young university graduates and dropouts who specialized in science, technology, and engineering now found themselves as big fish in a small pond, rather than vice versa in the real world. But this freedom to experiment and research without too many rules may have ultimately backfired. Due to the small number of cult members who had direct knowledge that Asahara wanted to develop biological, then chemical, weapons, this limited group had to rely on their own knowledge, research, and capabilities, which likely hindered their success in developing more potent strains of sarin and botulinum. In the years leading up to the Tokyo attack, Aum experimented with biological weapons, including anthrax and Q fever, which were cheaper to manufacture than chemical agents such as sarin and had the potential to kill millions of people. Aum Shinrikyo's massive cash flow also allowed the cult to acquire military equipment, including a Russian helicopter and missiles. Several buildings at the compound were dedicated to manufacturing germs, and Aum's labs would later be described in a New York Times article by William J. Broad as a maze of lab gear, glassware, and guru photos. At its peak, Aum Shinrikyo's membership was around 40,000, and the cult had friends in high places, including the government, judiciary, military, and press, though only 3,000 members lived communally. Aum's intelligence wing was also adept at brazen break-ins that gave them access to top-secret military information. On more than one occasion, Aum members broke into Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, an engineering and defense company that designed, among other things, nuclear power plants. Aum was able to pull off the heist because they were given employee uniforms and access by cult members who worked there. Once inside the Hiroshima plant, the cultists downloaded encrypted files with information that they could use for their own weapon development. 1990 to 1995 attacks. Though Aum would successfully produce a strain of sarin that managed to kill people, there was a naive and bumbling element to the cult's capabilities and production, despite all their wealth and planning. Aum's scientists likely exposed themselves to the deadly agents they were working to make. The cult used an apprentice-style program to increase the number of people working on weapons development. This meant that cultists who previously worked in publishing and illustration now found themselves brandishing welders, which led to a number of injuries. In 1993, Aum members released anthrax spores into a building that did little more than stink up the air and kill a few plants and animals. Plans to purchase a giant laser from a company in California fell through because Aum wanted the custom-made, $500,000 laser to be available to them immediately. Aum was able to smuggle an AK-47 into the country, but only managed to make one copy of the assault rifle. With biological weapons not working the way Asahara and his team had hoped, the guru turned to sarin, a highly toxic synthetic chemical that can be spread rapidly both through the air and by physical contact. According to Lifton, they thought of sarin as the poor man's atomic bomb, and Aum Shinrikyo likely learned how to make it from a Russian expert who visited the cult's headquarters. Aum had more than a significant presence in Russia, with some numbers putting Russian members at 30,000, far more than an estimated 10,000 Japanese followers. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, sarin and all nerve agents cause their toxic effects by preventing the proper operation of an enzyme that acts as the body's off switch for glands and muscles. Without this switch, the glands and muscles are constantly stimulated. People who are exposed to sarin may become fatigued. Other serious side effects include a change in heart rate and blood pressure, blurred vision, confusion, convulsions, and respiratory failure. Sarin doesn't have a color or taste, and quickly evaporates into vapor after exposing people to its deadly effects. The cult tested the toxic chemicals at a 500,000-acre ranch that they had purchased in a desolate area hundreds of miles north of Perth, Australia, on land believed to contain uranium, a metal that can be enhanced to make nuclear weapons. But Asahara and 25 of his followers didn't travel lightly, or inconspicuously, down under. They were fined by Australian authorities for attempting to ship toxic chemicals in containers marked hand soap. Despite its nefarious activities, Aum did not seem to adopt even modest operational security procedures during this trip, Parakini writes. Either its members believed that the rightness of their mission would safeguard them from the authorities, or they were incredibly naive. Following this trip, most of the group was denied visas for a repeat visit to Australia. However, a few who eventually obtained visas returned to the ranch to test toxic agents on sheep. Traces of sarin were found in 24 sheep carcasses at the ranch, which the cult had named Banjawarn. Locals from the desert town also witnessed a strange blast that sent a bright light through the air, causing the ground to shake enough to register 3.6 on the Richter scale, the level of a small earthquake. The fact that Aum's biological and chemical weapons were never as potent as Asahara would have liked didn't stop the cult from carrying out an estimated 14 attacks between 1990 and 1995. Sprayers mounted on trucks released botulinum toxin near a U.S. military base and Japanese government buildings. Their most deadly attack before the one in the Tokyo underground happened in the city of Matsumoto in 1994. 8 people were killed and hundreds more injured when Aum Shinrikyo sprayed sarin near an apartment complex where judges, who were set to rule on a land dispute they were involved in, resided. Local police investigated a local businessman, Yoshiyuki Kono, and his trial by media depicted him as the main suspect until after Aum's motives were revealed following the Tokyo attack. In early 1995, Aum Shinrikyo attackers posing as joggers sprayed Hiroyuki Nagaoka with VX nerve gas as he was walking through his Tokyo neighborhood. Nagaoka was saved by his sweater and collar, which blocked most of the liquid from his skin. At the time, he didn't know that he had been attacked, but back at home, he lost his ability to see and felt as though his chest and lungs were on fire. He lost consciousness and thrashed around on the floor before being taken to the hospital, where a doctor recognized the signs of exposure to nerve gas. Nagaoka was targeted because he led a support group for parents whose children had joined Aum Shinrikyo. Nagaoka, who still experiences numbness on the right side of his body more than 20 years after the attack, didn't know for sure that the cultists were behind the attack until it was revealed at trial many years later. On March 15, 1995, Aum Shinrikyo members carrying briefcases with the necessary alterations descended into the Tokyo subway station, intending to spray botulinum. Nothing happened. It's unclear if the biological weapon was intentionally left out or not. 5 days later, 5 attackers would board the subway trains in Tokyo with those newspaper-wrapped packages of sarin and their umbrellas, carrying out the deadly subway mission. If Shoko Asahara could have had his way, the attack would have been much deadlier. Working a tip that a police raid was planned for the cult's headquarters, Asahara hastily moved up the attack date, which was scheduled for November. If all had gone according to plan, Asahara would have released 70 tons of sarin over Tokyo from helicopters. Thousands, if not millions, could have been killed. Arrests in Japan's trial of the century. High-ranking Aum Shinrikyo members would be arrested in the months following the subway attack. Some members, including medical chief Ikuo Hayashi, confessed to their roles. In May 1995, some 2,000 officers descended on the Aum Shinrikyo compound with warrants for 40 members, including Asahara. It took police 4 hours to track down the cult leader, who was found meditating in a secret room between the second and third floors of a building, dressed in purple robes. Responding law enforcement had expected the cult to retaliate and were appropriately outfitted in gas masks and protective suits on loan from the Japanese self-defense forces. No additional sarin was found in Aum's labs, which were sealed off by police in the days following the subway attack. The raid did, however, turn up a written order in which Asahara decreed that the cult should start experimenting with sarin, as well as detailing missile fragments and new laboratories in the works. With Asahara in jail, Fumihiro Joyu, a high-ranking Aum Shinrikyo member serving in Moscow, became the group's spokesperson. Despite the devastation Aum inflicted on Japan, and hoped to on the world, the group continues to operate under increased police surveillance and a law that requires them to contribute to victim compensation. The group has maintained that these measures violate their civil rights as a religious organization. After the attack, Aum rebranded under the new name Aleph, and the group, with Joyu at the helm, started recruiting new members in 1997 and got back to work opening businesses and acquiring properties. Joyu tried to distance the group from Asahara and his violent acts, which eventually led to a split in 2003 after Joyu had Asahara's books and videos removed from Aleph's buildings. Asahara loyalists stayed with Aleph, and those who wanted to be done with their former guru followed Joyu, who started a new group called Hikari no Wa. Joyu maintains Hikari no Wa is a philosophy, not a religion. The group was surveilled along with Aleph until September 2017, when a Japanese court ruled in favor of Hikari and suspended surveillance against the cult, which has about 150 members. The trials for Shoko Asahara, his ministers, and other high-ranking Aum members would become Japan's trial of the century, dragging on until 2018, when Japan's Supreme Court upheld a final appeal. Shoko Asahara was sentenced to death in 2004 following an 8-year trial. Asahara's state-appointed lawyers tried to distance Asahara from his followers, whom they say acted independently and not on their leaders' orders. Asahara, who some say purposely acted crazy during his trial and accused the judge of zapping his brain with radiation, didn't answer questions coherently. When he was sentenced on numerous charges to death by hanging, the guru had to be forced on his feet by court guards. It took 4 hours for the judge to read the verdicts, and during this time Ashera smiled, yawned, snorted, mumbled to himself, and smelled his fingers. All in all, 12 additional members of Aum Shinrikyo were sentenced to death for their crimes, and 5 more received life sentences. Lawyers representing Seiichi Endo, who helped manufacture sarin and was convicted of murder for the Tokyo and Matsumoto attacks, claimed that his mind was being controlled by Asahara, and that he had no idea what the deadly liquid would be used for. The trials dragged on for so long because 3 cultists were on the lam until 2011. In March 2018, 7 of the 13 Aum members on death row were transported from the Tokyo detention center to different prisons in preparation for their executions. Aleph and other groups, including Amnesty International, Japan Society for Cult Prevention and Recovery, and a coalition of Buddhists, asked that the men be spared. But on July 6, Japan ordered the executions of Asahara and 6 of his followers. The remaining death row cultists were put to death on July 26. Justice Minister Yoko Kamikawa, who ordered the executions, will be guarded for the rest of her life along with her immediate family, to protect them from retaliation. Aum Shinrikyo's ability to acquire and manufacture weapons of mass destruction had serious international implications in a pre-9/11 world, with the sarin attacks serving as a wake-up call that do-it-yourself weapons were possible and that pathogens and other potentially deadly compounds weren't being safely regulated. All it took for Aum to get their hands on anthrax was a member's medical license. Fighting germ terrorism became a priority, and President Bill Clinton announced that the U.S. would keep a stockpile of vaccines and antibiotics. VX, the nerve agent that Aum members sprayed on their adversaries' necks while posing as joggers, was back in the limelight in late 2017, when the substance was used to assassinate Kim Jong-nam. Closed-circuit video surveillance captured the attack on North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's half-brother, who was approached by 2 women in a Malaysian airport who smeared a substance in his face. He died about 20 minutes later on his way to the hospital. A few months later, a research paper warning of the use of VX in future attacks came from the unlikeliest co-author, Tamamasa Nakagawa, one of the 7 Aum Shinrikyo members executed for his role in the sarin attacks. Incoherent or otherwise, many believe Asahara continued to guide Aleph until the time of his death. The cult, which has an estimated 1,500 members, seems to be up to their old tricks, attracting new, young members through yoga classes, failing to mention their violent history, and bilking followers out of thousands of dollars in membership fees. Other countries are far less tolerant of the cult. In 2016, Russia, which had a sizable Aum membership, officially banned Aleph after the country's Supreme Court designated it a terrorist organization. Earlier that year, Montenegro deported nearly 60 foreign Aleph members whom officials said were staying in the country illegally.